As a young gas station attendant scribbled a message on Michael Jordan's receipt, he knew every second was ticking away. The sound of shattering glass pierced the quiet of the early morning. Emma stood frozen, the remnants of her father's prized crystal decanter scattered across the hardwood floor of his study. But it wasn't the broken glass that made her blood run cold. It was the yellowed envelope that had tumbled out from its hidden compartment in the base. Her hands trembled as she carefully picked it up, avoiding the sharp edges surrounding her. The paper felt fragile, like it might disintegrate at her touch. Inside was a photograph she'd never seen before, a woman with familiar eyes, her eyes, holding an infant, standing beside a man who wasn't her father. On the back, written in Tuesday's faded ink, Olivia, James and Emma. Santa Fe, 1992. The front door slammed downstairs. Her father was home early. "Emma, where are you?" His voice carried up the stairs, tinged with unusual tension. She quickly stuffed the photo back into the envelope, her mind racing. Olivia, her mother's name. But the man in the photo wasn't. Richard Henderson, the man who had raised her for 28 years. The man who had told her that her mother died in childbirth. "Emma?" His footsteps were on the stairs now. She slipped the envelope into her pocket and turned to face the doorway just as he appeared, his imposing frame filling the entrance to his study. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was low, controlled, but his eyes darted immediately to the broken glass on the floor, then back to her face with an intensity that made her step back. "I was looking for some papers for the foundation dinner," she lied, her voice steadier than she expected. "I accidentally knocked over your decanter, I'm sorry." Richard's gaze remained fixed on the floor, and Emma realized with a jolt of fear that he wasn't looking at the glass. He was looking at the empty hidden compartment now exposed in the broken base. When he finally looked up, the man she had known her entire life was gone. In his place stood someone with cold, calculating eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she had. "Where is it?" he asked quietly. "Where's what?" she managed, taking another step back. His movement was swift, unexpected. In 2 strides, he crossed the room and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "Don't play games with me, Emma." His voice remained eerily calm. "The envelope, where is it?" The sharp pain in her wrist and the stranger's eyes in her father's face made everything crystallize with sudden clarity. The foundation dinner she was helping him organize tonight, the one that would honor Richard Coleman for his philanthropy and community leadership in Meridian Heights, the carefully crafted public image, the controlled environment he'd kept her in all these years. All of it was built on something false. "Let go of me," she said, surprising herself with her steadiness. His grip tightened instead. "You don't understand what you've found. Give it to me and we can forget this happened." The doorbell rang downstairs, its chime cutting through the tension between them. Richard's head jerked toward the sound, momentarily distracted. It was enough. Emma twisted free and darted past him, down the sweeping staircase of the home that suddenly felt like a beautiful prison. Behind her, she heard him curse and follow. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Emma reached the door first and yanked it open, coming face to face with Detective Michael Jordan, the man she'd been quietly dating for 3 months, the relationship she'd kept hidden from her father. "Mason," she gasped, relief flooding through her. His smile fell instantly as he took in her expression and the red marks forming on her wrist. His hand moved instinctively toward the weapon at his hip as Richard appeared behind her. "Emma," Mason said carefully, his eyes moving between them. "Everything okay?" She felt her father go still behind her, recalibrating in the presence of a police detective. The mask of Richard Coleman, respected community leader, slid back into place like it had never been gone. "Detective Jordan," Richard said smoothly. "What a surprise. I didn't realize you and my daughter were acquainted." "We need to talk," Emma said to Mason, stepping onto the porch, putting distance between herself and the man who had raised her. The weight of the envelope burned in her pocket. Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Actually, Mr. Coleman, I'm here on official business. There's been a development in a cold case we're working on. I was hoping you might be able..." to help us with some information." Richard's face didn't change, but Emma felt the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of his posture. "A cold case?" Richard's voice was perfectly controlled. "What case would that be?" "The disappearance of Olivia James," Mason said, "and her husband." The name from the photograph hit Emma like a physical blow. She turned to look at Richard, just in time to see the mask slip, revealing something dark and desperate in his eyes before he could hide it again. In that moment, Emma knew. Whatever truth lay inside that envelope, it was dangerous enough to destroy the life her father had built, and he would do anything to keep it buried. "5 years earlier. Vanessa Henderson had always been afraid of disappointing her father. Most people in Meridian Heights only saw Richard Coleman as the successful businessman who had transformed their small Connecticut town through strategic development and generous philanthropy. They didn't see how his approval was something Emma had spent her entire life trying to earn. She stood now in his sprawling office at Henderson Enterprises, trying not to fidget as he reviewed the quarterly reports she'd prepared. At 23, freshly graduated with an MBA from Yale, she was determined to prove she could carry on the family legacy. "These projections for the riverfront development seem optimistic," Richard said, not looking up from the papers. "They're based on extensive market research," Emma replied, resisting the urge to defend herself more forcefully. "The property values along the West Bank have increased 17% since we announced the project." Richard nodded absently, continuing to flip through the pages. Emma knew what was coming next. "And what about your personal life? Still seeing that boy from the engineering department?" Emma suppressed a sigh. "No, Dad. We broke up last month." This finally made him look up, a slight smile softening his features. "Good. He wasn't right for you, Emma. Too ordinary. You're a Coleman. Never forget that means something in this town." She'd heard this speech countless times. The Coleman name opened doors, commanded respect, carried weight. And with it came responsibility. To the business, to the town, to maintaining the legacy Richard had built from nothing. "Actually, I've been thinking about taking some time off," Emma said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "Maybe travel for a few months before committing to a full-time position here." Richard's face hardened instantly. "That's not an option, Emma. The board is expecting you to take over the Community Relations Division next month. We've already made the announcement. But I never agreed to." "It's decided," he cut her off, his tone final. "I didn't build all this for you to find yourself on some aimless journey. Your mother would have wanted you to embrace your responsibilities." Emma's mother. The beautiful ghost who haunted their home through carefully framed photographs and Richard's occasional references. Olivia Coleman, who died giving birth to Emma, a fact Richard had used like a gentle cudgel throughout Emma's life. "Your mother sacrificed everything for you. Don't waste the life she gave you." "I wish I'd known her," Emma said quietly. Something flickered across Richard's face, so brief Emma might have imagined it. "She would have been proud of you," he said, his voice softening, "but also concerned about this impulsive streak you've developed." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation, and walked around the desk to kiss her forehead, a rare display of affection that made Emma's resolve waver. "Trust me, Emma. I only want what's best for you." Later that night, alone in her apartment above the town's bookstore, the one concession to independence Richard had grudgingly allowed, Emma stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She loved her father, respected him, wanted to make him proud. But lately, she'd begun to feel suffocated by his expectations, by the path he'd laid out for her with such certainty. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from her best friend, Lily Chen. "Still on as witness for tomorrow? Tyler's freaking out that you'll change your mind?" Emma smiled. Tyler Mendez had been battling with the town council, specifically with Coleman Enterprises, over the permits for his community arts center for nearly 2 years. Richard saw it as a waste of prime commercial real estate. Tyler, saw it as essential to revitalizing the struggling east side of town. Absolutely, 9 a.m. at town hall. Dad will hate it, but he can't stop me from speaking. This small act of rebellion felt significant. For once, she would speak her own mind, not simply echo her father's vision for Meridian Heights. Just don't get disowned over this, Lily texted back. Although if you need a place to crash, our couch is yours. Emma put down her phone, her resolve strengthening. Tomorrow would be a first step toward finding her own voice. She couldn't have known it would also be the first step toward unraveling everything she thought she knew about her life. The town council meeting had gone better than expected. Emma's testimony about the cultural and economic benefits of Tyler's proposed arts center had clearly swayed some of the undecided council members. Richard had been conspicuously absent, a relief, though Emma knew there would be consequences for her public opposition to his development plans. As she left town hall, she spotted a man watching her from across the street. Something about his intensity made her pause. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that suggested years spent outdoors. When their eyes met, he seemed to make a decision and crossed toward her. Emma Coleman. His voice was rough, hesitant. Yes? She clutched her purse closer, suddenly wary. My name is James Harlow. I need to speak with you about your mother. Emma froze. My mother died when I was born. The man's eyes, a startling blue that seemed somehow familiar, filled with a complex mixture of emotions. That's what he told you, he said quietly. But it's not the truth. Before Emma could respond, a town car pulled up beside them and Richard's head of security, Vince, stepped out. Miss Coleman, he said, positioning himself between Emma and the stranger. Your father asked me to drive you back to the office. James Harlow took a step back, his expression hardening. Think about what I said, Emma. Ask yourself why he's kept you so close all these years. He pressed a business card into her hand before Vince could intervene. When you're ready to hear the truth, call me. The card was simple. James Harlow, wildlife photographer. A phone number. Nothing to suggest why this man would claim to know anything about her mother. Who was that? Vince asked as he opened the car door for her. Nobody, Emma said, slipping the card into her pocket. Just someone who liked my testimony. That night, alone in her apartment, Emma stared at the card for hours, turning it over and over in her fingers. She'd grown up with the story of her mother's death, complications during childbirth at a small hospital in Vermont, where Richard and Olivia had been vacationing when Emma arrived 3 weeks early. There were no medical records. Richard had explained they were lost in a hospital filing system update years ago. No family on Olivia's side to fill in the gaps. She'd been raised in the foster system after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7. All Emma had were the photographs Richard kept in their home and the stories he told of their brief, passionate marriage. Olivia had been a painter, he said, creative, free-spirited, beautiful. Emma had her eyes, her smile, her artistic sensibility. With trembling fingers, Emma dialed the number on the card. James Harlow, came the gruff answer after 2 rings. This is Emma Coleman, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell me about my mother. The last thing Detective Michael Reed had expected when moving to Meridian Heights was to fall for the daughter of the town's most powerful man. He'd transferred from Boston PD 6 months ago, seeking a quieter pace after a shooting that had left him physically healed but mentally scarred. Small-town policing was supposed to be straightforward. Then he'd met Emma Coleman at a charity fundraiser, and nothing had been simple since. Mason had recognized her name immediately. Richard Coleman was essentially the unofficial mayor of Meridian Heights, but he hadn't expected the genuine warmth beneath her polished exterior or the subtle sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Their relationship had developed cautiously over coffee meetings and quiet dinners in neighboring towns, always with Emma's insistence that her father not know. Mason had respected her boundaries, though he found it odd that a grown woman would be so concerned about her father's approval of her dating life. Now, sitting across from Emma in his sparsely furnished apartment, watching her hands shake as she slid a weathered envelope across his kitchen table, Mason understood her fear wasn't about disapproval, it was about something much darker. I found this hidden in my father's study this morning, she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "After what happened with James Harlow 3 months ago, I've been looking for evidence." Mason carefully opened the envelope and examined the photograph inside. A young couple with a baby, standing in front of a modest house with mountains visible in the background. He recognized Emma's eyes in the woman's face. "This is your mother?" he asked. Emma nodded. "Olivia James, not Coleman. And that's her husband, James Harlow." She pointed to the man in the photo, the same man who approached me after the town council meeting, the man who disappeared the next day. Mason felt a chill run through him. Disappeared? His hotel room was cleared out, his cell phone disconnected. "It's like he vanished." Emma leaned forward, her eyes intense. "After he spoke to me, I called him that night. He told me my mother didn't die in childbirth. He said she and my father, my real father, had been environmental activists investigating water contamination from one of Richard's early development projects in New Mexico." "And you believe him?" "I didn't at first, but then he promised to show me proof. We arranged to meet the next morning, but he never showed up." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent 3 months trying to verify his story. I found newspaper articles about the contamination case from 1992. Olivia and James Harlow were leading the fight against a company called RH Developments." "Richard Coleman," Mason said, the pieces clicking into place. "My birth certificate says I was born in Santa Fe, not Vermont like Richard always told me. And my mother's maiden name is listed as James, not Parker like he claimed." Emma pulled out a folded document from her bag. "I requested this from the New Mexico Vital Records Office. It lists James Harlow as my father." Mason studied the certificate, his detective's mind racing through implications. "Emma, if what you're saying is true, my entire life has been a lie," she finished for him. "And now I have to wonder what happened to my real parents and why did Richard Coleman take me and raise me as his own?" Mason didn't voice the darkest possibility, that Richard Coleman might have been directly responsible for the disappearance of Emma's true parents, that the man who raised her might be capable of murder. "We need to be careful how we proceed," Mason said instead. "Richard has connections throughout the state. If he realizes we're investigating—" "He already knows I found something," Emma said, touching the fading marks on her wrist. "And now you've connected the dots by asking about Olivia James. We don't have much time." Mason reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Let me take you somewhere safe while I look into this officially." Emma shook her head. "No, the foundation dinner is tonight. Half the town will be there, including the mayor and the police chief. Richard will never risk doing anything with so many witnesses around." Her jaw set with determination. "Besides, I need to confront him. I need to hear the truth from him." "Emma, that's too dangerous. I've spent my entire life being controlled by that man," she cut him off. "Finding out why is the only way I'll ever be free of him." Mason recognized the resolve in her eyes. She would do this with or without his support. "Then we do it together," he said. "But we need a plan." The Henderson Foundation annual charity gala transformed the town's historic hotel into a showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. The town's elite mingled, in formal attire, orbiting around Richard Coleman like planets around a sun. Emma moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations on the event's success, deflecting questions about her father's upcoming speech. No one seemed to notice how tightly she clutched her champagne flute, or how her eyes constantly tracked Richard's movement across the room. Mason was positioned near the entrance in plain clothes, having called in a favor from a former colleague who now worked private security for events like this. Through their discreet earpieces, he and Emma remained connected. "He's speaking with Judge Harmon now," Mason's voice came through softly. "The chief just arrived with his wife." "Copy that," Emma murmured, turning to smile at an approaching town councilman. Richard had been perfectly composed since their confrontation that morning, slipping into his public persona without missing a beat. When Emma had returned home to prepare for the gala, he'd behaved as though nothing had happened, complimenting her dress and reviewing the evening's schedule with his usual precision. It was almost time for his speech, the centerpiece of the evening, where he would announce a significant new donation to the town's hospital. Emma needed to intercept him before he reached the podium. She spotted her opportunity when Richard excused himself from a conversation and headed toward a quiet hallway that led to the restrooms. With a deep breath, she followed. "Richard," she called once they were alone in the corridor. He turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Emma, is there a problem with the arrangements?" "I know the truth," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "About Olivia and James Harlow. About who I really am." For a long moment, Richard simply stared at her, his face betraying nothing. Then, with a slight movement of his shoulders, almost like releasing a burden, his demeanor changed. "I wondered when this day would come," he said, his voice different somehow, colder, more calculating. "Though I admit, I didn't expect James to find you after all these years." "What did you do to him?" Emma demanded. "He disappeared after speaking to me." Richard's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "The same thing I did 28 years ago when he and your mother threatened to destroy everything I'd built. I made a problem disappear." Emma felt physically ill at the casual way he confirmed her worst fears. "You killed them. Olivia died in an unfortunate accident when she wouldn't listen to reason," Richard said, his voice eerily calm. "James proved more adaptable. Once he understood the consequences of pursuing the matter, he agreed to leave. I gave him a new identity, a comfortable life far away." His eyes narrowed. "Until recently, it seems." "And me?" Emma's voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "Why take me? Why raise your enemy's child?" Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a complex emotion Emma couldn't quite identify. "You were leverage at first, insurance that James would honor our arrangement, but then—" He hesitated, showing the first crack in his composure. "You became more than that." "Mason knows everything," Emma said, taking a step back. "It's over. Richard, whatever you built on these lies, it ends tonight." Richard glanced at his watch, then back at Emma with an unsettling calmness. "Does Detective Reed know about the evidence in the safe behind my office painting? Or about the property in Vermont where I've kept everything that could connect me to Santa Fe?" He shook his head slightly. "No, Emma, this doesn't end tonight, but something does." The subtle change in his tone sent alarm bells ringing through Emma's mind. "What have you done?" "The same thing I've always done," Richard said. "Protected." "What's mine?" He gestured toward the main ballroom. "In approximately 3 minutes, an electrical fire will start in the hotel's aging wiring system. In the chaos, certain things will be resolved." Emma's blood ran cold. "There are over 200 people out there." "And the sprinkler system will activate promptly," Richard countered. "There may be smoke inhalation, minor injuries, but the true danger is minimal, except for those who find themselves in the wrong place when more targeted incidents occur." "Mason," Emma whispered, fumbling for her earpiece only to realize it had gone silent. "Signal jammers are remarkable devices," Richard commented. "Now, shall we rejoin the party? I believe it's almost time for my speech." Emma backed away, from him, her mind racing. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." "Emma," Richard said, his voice taking on a gentler tone that was somehow more frightening than his coldness. "You've been my daughter for 28 years. Nothing will change that. When this unpleasantness is behind us, we'll rebuild. Together." Chapter Scene. That moment, Emma saw clearly what she had sensed but never fully acknowledged throughout her life. Richard Coleman was a man who reshaped reality to suit his needs, who eliminated obstacles without remorse, who had fooled an entire town and her for decades. But she was Richard Coleman's daughter in one respect. She knew how to act decisively when necessary. Emma turned and ran toward the main ballroom, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Fire! Everyone needs to evacuate immediately." Behind her, she heard Richard curse as chaos instantly erupted. The crowd began to move toward the exits, confusion turning to urgency as the fire alarm began to wail seconds later. Emma pushed against the flow of the crowd, desperately scanning for Mason. She spotted him near the stage, looking for her, and began fighting her way toward him. A hand gripped her arm with painful force, spinning her around. Richard's face was twisted with a rage she'd never seen before. "You ungrateful," he hissed, but was cut off as someone slammed into him in the panicked crowd, momentarily loosening his grip. Emma tore free and continued pushing toward Mason, who had now spotted her and was trying to reach her. Through the chaos, their eyes locked, a moment of connection amid the disorder. Then the first explosion came from somewhere behind the stage. The aftermath unfolded like scenes from a nightmare. Smoke filled the ballroom as the sprinklers rained down, creating a surreal mist through which shadowy figures stumbled toward exits. Emergency lights cast eerie red glows through the haze. Emma found herself on the floor, disoriented, her ears ringing from the blast. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her up. Mason, his face streaked with soot, his mouth moving with words she couldn't hear through the ringing in her ears. She let him guide her toward a side exit, away from the main crush of people. Behind them, through gaps in the smoke, she caught glimpses of emergency responders arriving, of people being treated for injuries. No sign of Richard. The cool night air hit Emma's face as Mason pushed through a service door, leading them into an alley behind the hotel. Her hearing was returning in patches, Mason's voice fading in and out as he guided her toward a police cruiser parked at the end of the alley. "Need to get you somewhere safe," he was saying. "Officers at the other exits looking for—" A figure stepped out from the shadows ahead of them. Richard, his expensive suit now rumpled and stained with smoke, a small revolver steady in his hand. "That's far enough," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. Mason pushed Emma behind him, reaching for his weapon only to find his holster empty. Richard smiled thinly. "Looking for this?" He held up Mason's service, weapon in his other hand, before tossing it aside with a clatter. One of the advantages of owning the security company that works these events, so many reliable people willing to do small favors. "Richard, it's over," Mason said, keeping his body between Emma and the gun. "The fire department is already here. Police are securing all exits. You can't escape." "I don't need to escape," Richard replied. "I need to contain the situation, as I always have." His eyes shifted to Emma. "Come here, Emma." She stepped out from behind Mason, ignoring his attempt to hold her back. "No," she said simply. Richard's expression hardened. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've built for you to inherit." "You built it all on lies," Emma said. "On my mother's death, on stealing me from my real father. I gave you a better life than James Harlow ever could have." Richard's composure cracked for the first time, genuine emotion bleeding through. "He was nobody, a crusading photographer with more principles than sense. I made you somebody." "You made me a prisoner," Emma countered. "Every choice, every relationship, every aspect of my life, you controlled it all." Richard's jaw tightened. "I protected you." "You used me," Emma said, "as leverage, as a trophy, as a replacement for whatever emptiness was inside you." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Richard's eyes darted toward the mouth of the alley, then back to Emma and Mason. "I love you, Emma," he said, and for perhaps the first time in her life, Emma believed he meant it, in his own twisted way. "Everything I did for us." "Richard Coleman," a voice called from behind them as flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "This is the police. Drop your weapon." Time seemed to slow. Richard looked at the approaching officers, then back. At Emma with an expression she couldn't decipher, regret perhaps or resignation. For a heartbeat she thought he might surrender. Instead, he raised his gun toward Mason. "No!" Emma lunged forward just as Richard pulled the trigger. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. A strange warmth spread across her abdomen as she crumpled to the ground. Gunshots echoed through the alley, police returning fire. Through dimming vision, Emma saw Richard fall, saw Mason's anguished face as he knelt beside her, pressing his hands against her wound. "Stay with me, Emma," he was saying, his voice sounding very far away. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." Emma wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, that for the first time in her life she had made a choice that was entirely her own. But darkness was closing in, and she couldn't find the words. Her last thought before consciousness slipped away was of the photograph, her real parents holding her, love evident in their eyes. A glimpse of the life that might have been, had truth not been buried beneath decades of lies. 1 year later, Emma stood at the edge of Echo Lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The mountain air was crisp, with early autumn carrying the scent of pine and the distant smoke of campfires. "Beautiful evening," said a voice behind her. She turned to see James Harlow, her father, approaching along the shoreline path, camera bag slung over his shoulder. At 63, he moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to navigating difficult terrain, both literal and metaphorical. "Perfect light for photography," Emma agreed, smiling as he joined her at the water's edge. They stood in comfortable silence, watching an osprey circle above the lake before diving for a fish. James raised his camera, capturing the moment with practiced efficiency. "How's the physical therapy going?" he asked, lowering the camera. Emma pressed a hand to her side, where the bullet had torn through her, missing vital organs by millimeters. "Better. Dr. Landon says I might be able to start jogging again next month." James nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering concern. The past year had been a journey of healing for both of them. Emma recovering from her physical wounds, both of them navigating the complicated terrain of building a relationship after 28 years apart. "And the nightmares?" he asked, quietly. "Less frequent," Emma admitted. She still sometimes woke, gasping for breath, the sound of gunshots echoing in her mind, Richard's face in those final moments haunting her. "Mason helps." As if summoned by her words, Mason appeared on the path behind them, carrying a thermos and 3 mugs. In the month since the shooting, he had become Emma's anchor, his steady presence helping her rebuild her life on truth rather than lies. "Hot chocolate," he announced, joining them, "with a little something extra for the adults." Emma accepted a mug gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her hands. The 3 of them settled on a weathered bench facing the lake, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I filed the final paperwork today," Emma said after a while. "The Coleman Foundation assets have all been redirected to the Environmental Trust." After Richard's death, Emma had inherited everything, a fortune built on deception and occasionally criminal business practices. She had spent months working with lawyers and financial advisors to dismantle Richard Coleman's empire and redirect its resources toward repairing some of the damage he had done. The irony wasn't lost on her. Olivia and James had been fighting to hold RC Developments accountable for environmental damage when Richard had destroyed their family. Now, that same money would fund watershed protection, habitat restoration, and environmental justice initiatives across the country. "Your mother would be proud," James said softly. "She always believed that people could change the world if they were brave enough to try." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of who she had been and who she was becoming settle into a new balance. The photograph of her parents holding her as a baby now sat framed on her bedside table, a reminder of the truth she had fought to uncover. "I wish I could have known her," Emma said. "You do," James replied, his voice gentle. "She's in you, in your determination, your compassion, your willingness to stand up for what's right." He took her hand, his weathered fingers closing around hers. "Every time you choose truth over comfort, every time you help someone else find their voice, that's Olivia living on." The stars were emerging now, reflecting in the still surface of the lake. Emma breathed deeply, feeling a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. She had lost the father who raised her, discovered the father who had been taken from her, and in the process, found herself. The weight of echoes from the past would always be with her, but now finally she was free to create her own future,